Hello and a very warm welcome to our online event, Europe's Refugee Crises, Where Are We Now? This event is hosted by the LSE European Institute and 89 Initiative and is part of the LSE European Institute event series, Beyond Eurocentrism. My name is Dr. Manmit Bhambra. I'm Research Officer at the LSE's Religion and Global Society Research Unit and Research Director for Migration at the 89 Initiative for Belgium. And I'm very pleased to be chairing this event today and to welcome in our panel. Before we begin, I do have some housekeeping announcements. For those of you using Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is LSE Eurocentrism. Our event today, in terms of format, will consist of presentations from our speakers, followed by discussion. There will also be an opportunity for you to submit a question using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to myself and I will then put them forward to the speakers. I'm very happy now to introduce our panel in order of speaking. Firstly, we have Catherine Woollard. Catherine has been the Director of the European Council of Refugees and Exiles since 2016. ECRE is a pan-European alliance of 108 NGOs in 40 European countries working to defend the rights of refugees and displaced persons. We also have Lucy Mayblin, who is a political sociologist. Lucy's research focuses on asylum, human rights and policy making and the legacies of colonialism. She was recently awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for her research achievements in the area of asylum and migration. We're very happy to welcome Masooma Torfa. Masooma is the co-founder and directing member of Female Fellows, an NGO that is working on the integration and empowerment of migrant women in southern Germany. Masooma grew up in Afghanistan and is currently a PhD researcher on forced migration and refugee integration at the University of Hohenheim in Germany. Lastly, we have Heaven Crawley. Heaven is Professor of International Migration at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Heaven is also the Director of the UK RICE GCRF South-South Migration Inequality and Development Hub. So before I start this discussion, something that we've all been mindful of in the run-up to this event is how do we make space for other voices in this discussion? And I'm hoping that our audience, as well as our speakers, will think about how do we ensure that those people who are directly impacted in their lives by these issues of displacement and their stories are brought into these discussions. So we don't always focus on necessarily the academic and policy part of this issue, but the everydayness of these issues and these challenges facing people. So to start the discussion, I'm very happy to hand over to Catherine, and Catherine would be the first person to start, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Bhambra, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. So I'm going to give an overview on the main changes that we see since the political crisis of 2015. And I've got four main areas of change. I should note, though, that these changes are really, they really involve exacerbation of existing trends rather than radical shifts or changes in direction that result from the events of 2015-2016. There is continuity going back 20, 30 years in terms of policy. We talk about the political crisis on refugee issues, or the political crisis in Europe on asylum and migration, avoiding, as I'm sure many others do, the term the refugee crisis, since these were very much crises of Europe, crises of European politics and crises of European identity. The first change is a reduction in the rights of refugees in Europe and a shrinking of protection space in Europe. Since 2015, we've seen legal changes that focus on limiting the number of people offered protection in Europe, rather than on making asylum systems function. There are changes to legal frameworks at national level and proposed changes to EU asylum law, with packages of proposals launched in 2016 and last year in 2020. These include many different features, such as reductions in the right to appeal. Even though a review or an appeal is a normal part of any legal process, it's not something specific to asylum. We see harsher approaches to status determination. So, for instance, in the proposed increased use of safe third country concepts, and we see restrictions in movement. We also see in practice a restrictive approach and a failure on the part of the European Union in particular to respond to violations that are taking place, where legal obligations existing in EU and international law are not being respected. There's also a trend that we find rather more worrying, which is a certain politicization of courts. So when the political environment on these issues has been hostile, we've tended to rely on courts to defend the right to asylum in Europe. We're seeing, particularly at the Strasbourg court, a certain more restrictive approach to interpretation and a number of rather worrying decisions in key strategic cases, including cases where we intervened. So I would say none of this is new, however. So we see these trends going back much before 2015. What has changed to some extent is that the interior ministries that pursue this strategy and this approach have been able to count on the support of heads of government because of this sense of crisis on this issue. There's also this sense that it became an existential crisis for the European Union itself, which meant that certain countries that were previously rather more progressive or moderate were pulled into a more restrictive position because they believed, in our view wrongly, that the EU itself was at threat. And that for this country here, Belgium, I would argue that that's possibly the case in point. There's a certain irony in all of this approach. The restriction and the attempt to limit the number of people arriving is based on the belief, again perhaps mistaken, that European countries could come to agreements on solidarity and responsibility sharing if only people were restricted from arriving. But of course, if nobody arrives, then to whom is protection being offered, and who is benefiting from that solidarity that supposedly will arrive? There's a sense that the conflicts among, the very deep and bitter conflicts among different European actors, states, can only be resolved if people are prevented from arriving. And this is often justified by the argument that most people arriving are not refugees. In fact, our analysis of the statistics shows that the majority of those arriving are in need of protection and do get a positive protection decision if legal processes are followed through to the appeal and review stage. And just today, again, I was in a discussion where a senior member of the German government misrepresented the decisions by referring only to first instance decision making. And so there's that sense that this can be justified because people don't have protection needs. In fact, they do. It's much more complex. A second change that we note is outsourcing of responsibilities to other regions by Europe. The EU-Turkey deal is the epitome of this approach. It's considered a success because Turkey prevents people from leaving from Turkey, and that's led to an impetus to try to replicate that model. And that in turn leads to a diversion of external funding and a distortion of external and foreign policies. Often this doesn't work. The conditions in Turkey and the reason that Turkey agreed are very particular. and also actually very damaging for the relationship with Turkey. But there are great opportunity costs through pursuing this kind of approach, and it may even lead to more displacement because we see deals done with, at times, repressive governments that are themselves the source of displacement. We would say that the accession and neighbourhood policies of the EU are particularly at risk at present. Globally, international law has not changed. The status quo holds. The Global Compact on Refugees is also a status quo agreement, but the global protection system is put at risk by this policy of outsourcing. The third change I'll mention is a sort of paradoxical Europeanization. So on the one hand, there has been the debate that the EU has been unable to respond, but the EU is held responsible for the crisis. Public opinion is very interesting, showing that people don't consider in general across the EU member states, they don't consider that migration is a challenge for their countries, but they consider that it is a challenge for the EU. So that means that they see the responsibility lying there, and the EU has tried to act. We also see a kind of Europeanization in the sense that there's a new interest in EU foreign policy from member states that have really not been bothered about it before, but now want to try to use it to facilitate return or to prevent people moving. So my final point in terms of changes is a more positive one. I think in recent years, we've seen that the opposition to an anti-asylum and restrictive approach, the opposition has been consolidated, it's been galvanized, and it's increased. In Europe, we see NGOs, volunteers, activists, professionals. We see increasingly affected people themselves, refugee advocates, refugee-led organizations. But we also see outside Europe, opposition, for instance, public and political opposition in Africa and elsewhere. So as an example, we've published a whole set of papers from African analysts that look at the impact of EU policies in their countries, and we'll host a discussion on the Gambia next week, if I just plug that. But there's real mobilization against what is perceived as a narrow European-driven agenda. For NGOs, specialist think tanks, academics, and even to some extent the media, there is quite a strong, uncompromising and quite united resistance to some of these changes, and that serves to some extent as a counterweight. On the other hand, we do see deep divisions in institutions, in governments, and in agencies. So some of the restrictive proposals are blocked because of divisions on that side. We also see that public opinion has actually become more positive towards immigration in the last couple of years for a whole variety of reasons, including COVID. And that's the case except where the extreme right dominates government. So it's not even their presence in a coalition, but it's the domination that means that public opinion goes in and remains in a negative direction towards immigration more widely and towards refugee protection within that. I would also say that there's an irony here in that the less the issue is in the media, the less problematic things happen. So it's an issue, unlike many other political issues, where we're not necessarily looking for attention, but looking for working solutions and alternatives outside of the glare of media attention, and their alternatives can be put forward. I'm going to stop there and happy to go into more detail in the discussion if there are questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Lucy?
Thanks, thank you, Manmit. And what an honour really to be included in this panel of impressive women. So thank you for inviting me. I think what I'm going to say is quite complementary really to and echoes many of Catherine's words. So my first thought when I saw the title of this event when I was invited was to wonder what was meant by the crisis. So the events surrounding the Syrian refugee crisis, which became visible to Europeans in around 2015-16, but began earlier and is ongoing, that was a crisis and is a crisis for Syrians, but it didn't need to be a crisis for Europe. And yet those events did come to be narrated, of course, as we can see in the title of this event, as a refugee crisis for Europe. Most Syrians fled to neighboring countries. The proportion of Syrians fleeing to Europe by percentage of the population at the height of the crisis was 0.25%. And for Lebanon, it was 20%. So in other words, the European refugee crisis, so-called, involved the arrival of people seeking asylum from war and persecution who together constituted 0.25% of the population of Europe. Most countries resisted burden sharing. So what happened in 2015-16 in Europe was really a failure of hospitality. And this failure of hospitality is no surprise to those of us with knowledge of Europe's history of refugee reception, which Catherine pointed to. Because I've only got a few minutes, I'm going to make a brief point linking all of this back to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and then extremely quickly sketch out some broad alternatives. So the 1951 Convention came in response to the displacements caused by the Second World War within Europe. In that context, people who had been displaced had found that they had rights only as a consequence of being a citizen of a particular state. If that state persecuted you or cast you out, you lost, in the words of Hannah Arendt, the right to have rights. So the 1951 Convention was meant to be a solution to this terrible situation. The world's powerful states agreed a suite of rights that people fleeing persecution would now have, and duties that signatory states would also have. And they did this in order to protect refugees, ostensibly. These rights include the right to cross a border without appropriate travel documents like visas, and the right to apply for asylum in a host state and have a fair assessment of your application, amongst other protections. But the 1951 Convention was limited to European refugees only, and this is because the colonial powers argued forcefully that colonized peoples were not ready for human rights. And this was in spite of strong and vocal objection by recently independent countries like Pakistan and India. But the right to asylum was not granted in those contexts, or extended refugee rights weren't extended there. So it was with a new protocol in 1967, which was devised in the context of decolonization and increasing demands for expanded rights for non-Europeans, that refugee rights were then expanded. But to be clear, the exclusion of non-Europeans in 1951 was an explicitly racist exclusion. While the colonial powers were willing to introduce this right to include Jewish Europeans, they did not see colonized peoples as full humans. And this is because the European empires were based around a racial schema in which Black and brown citizens of empire were thought of as inferior, as backward, as exploitable, as expendable. Their lives were simply worth less than European lives, which brings us quite swiftly to today. So we're now in a situation in which some of those populations who were purposefully excluded from refugee rights in 1951 are seeking asylum in Europe today, and those colonial assumptions live on, I would argue. The measures that we see pursued by European countries today to limit access to the right to asylum are very far from the spirit of this convention, but often just sit this side of legal. So they fulfill the letter of their commitment, but not the spirit of it. And again, this is because the colonial logic lives on. Examples of this include paying foreign powers to quarantine refugees outside of Europe, criminalizing those who help refugees, and carrier sanctions. And I'm sure you know, but just to explain, carrier sanctions are fines for airlines or ferry companies if somebody boards an aeroplane without appropriate travel documents. So you get the airlines to stop people boarding a plane to your country to claim asylum. And in this way, you don't break international law, but you certainly violate the spirit of it. So if you've ever wondered why people pay 10 times the cost of a plane ticket to cross the Mediterranean in a tiny leaky boat, carrier sanctions are the reason. So the policy creates the crisis. It would be, of course, unthinkable to scoop French or German citizens up in the sea and indefinitely detain them in squalid camps without proper access to medical care or due process. It would be unthinkable to imprison fishermen who saved drowning French and German citizens in the sea because you would prefer more to drown to send a message to other people from those countries not to make a particular journey. But these things are done to Kurds and Eritreans and Syrians because their lives are thought of as less important. They're more readily detained, abused, drowned, and impaled on razor wire. This is the reality in Europe. So a recent effort to boost commitment to refugee rights, which Catherine mentioned, the Global Compact on Refugees, which came after the Syrian crisis, also floundered in terms of proper action to focus attention primarily on the needs of the displaced rather than host states, and says little about the exclusionary impulses of wealthy states as contributing to refugee crises. And in part, this is because this underlying set of assumptions remains in many powerful donor states, including in Europe. So what would an alternative look like for Europe? First, it would be underpinned by a genuinely anti-racist vision of human equality. Second, it would be a collaboration between states, not on punishing people who are seeking asylum, but on supporting each other to support them. Third, it would be a linking of asylum policy with labour migration policy, since Europe has a huge demographic deficit and therefore a desperate need for immigration. And fourth, it would involve a recognition of the economic benefits of both immigration and public spending on it, as P.O. Hansen has outlined in his amazing new book, Modern Migration Theory, which I recommend to everyone. So I suppose my takeaway point in this extremely brief talk, kind of bite-sized talk that I've been given the opportunity to give, is that we're stuck in the exclusionary logics of the past, I think, but we don't need to be. A different asylum policy is possible, but it's out of reach while these kinds of logics continue to dominate thinking within Europe. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Masooma?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's an honor to share the panel with the distinguished panelists, Catherine from ECRE, the policy advocacy and advocacy for the refugees and asylum seekers in Europe is well known to all of us. Professor Crawley, whose research is well known to me, and I think to some of us. And it's an honor to also get introduced to Dr. Lucy and the rest of the Orga team. I would like to also attempt to answer this question by referring to the title. And I'm happy that that was not a surprise to me alone, and the rest of the colleagues also somehow referred to that. It's the Europe's refugee crisis. We might pause and ask ourselves this question: if there is a refugee crisis in Europe. I would go a bit deep into this to say that the term refugee crisis is very misleading, because it actually does not refer to the crisis that made people flee their countries of origin. That actually should refer to that. But instead it refers to the number of the arrivals here in Europe, which is not a crisis at all. And I think if we do some fact checks, there are, like the percentage of the total number of the refugee arrivals, the percentage of the world's refugees, if we see arrived in Europe, they're under 10%. And if that's compared to the total population of European Union, it's 0.6% based on the statistics from the European Commission, which is less than 1%, a bit more than 0.5% of the total population. How could that be? If we look at numbers arrived here, it's again not a crisis. So I think I myself personally prefer not to use the word crisis together with the refugees and asylum seekers, at least in Europe anymore. Yes, and if we talk about the crisis, I think we should refer to the countries of origins. In Afghanistan, for example, on daily basis, there are people losing their lives, civilians, civil servants, students, teachers, journalists on daily basis. There are bombs on daily basis in Afghanistan. One of the touching examples that's not far back ago, it's 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks ago, the targeted killing of almost like 100+ innocent schoolgirls in Dashti-Barchi, the capital, Kabul, in Afghanistan. So these are the crises. And there are tens of hundreds of people losing their lives in Syria, in Somalia, in other Middle Eastern, and the rest of the world that could be referred to as crises, as the countries of origin of the refugees, not the Europe. So coming to the crisis, what could be in Europe, it could be, it was also somehow touched upon by other colleagues, political disagreements, the lack of willingness to cooperate, the lack of solidarity at the European Union, and that could be, it's the reception management, for example, at the Greek islands, the pushbacks from Spain, Italy, and the rest of the countries like Greece, they could be referred to as catastrophes and crises, I would say. And where are we now? They're the different actors. We can refer to different actors at the different levels at the European Union, like the EU level, the national level, and the grassroots local level. To me, working with the small NGO, working for the empowerment of refugee and migrant women, as well as the locals together, because that's the strategy, that we do not only focus on refugee and migrant women, but we do like shared and joint projects of integration and empowerment of women together with the local citizens. So the grassroots level, there, the people like us and the colleagues and the committed team, and in our team, over 300+ motivated volunteers, they are working on refugee empowerment on daily basis. They do not see any crisis, and they're also, you know, the statistics also show that there are 9 million people who volunteers who have supported refugees, and in Germany alone. And the surveys also show that an absolute majority of the German population still welcome receiving refugees, which they do not see that as a crisis. They see that as a humanitarian situation, and the responsibility of countries like Germany, for example, to receive them. So what have, in the last 5 years, what have these actors achieved? If you check the national level, I would just give Germany as an example. What we see, you know, the capacity of the reception of the countries individually. They have developed this reception capacities, integration policies, their development of new integration policies, involvement of very different actors, cooperation initiatives, the role of cities, private sector, and civil society. That is something that was not in the history of some of the countries, including Germany. I think it is also valid for the rest of the EU member states who are receiving asylum seekers and refugees. If we look at the recent official figures from the German labor market, German labor agency, so more than half of all refugees of working age who arrived between 2013 and 2016 are in employment now. And majority of them are working in skilled professions, while another 44% are working in unskilled professions. So this itself is somehow what, when you look at the facts and figures, they still say that their successes achieved by different organizations and different member states, Germany as the major recipient of the refugees. So, and if you check the civil society, their incredible engagement of civil society more than any time before. And the academia, you see there are examples of the academia, the presence of them we have in our today's panel as well. More research on refugees in Europe is done ever in the history today. So integration policies, the actors and the challenges and opportunities, specifically on different countries and on different ethnic groups, such as Syria and Afghanistan, there are things that are under work in different universities and research institutes. And the role of the The role of the civil society, one important thing is the local community, refugee and migrant-led organizations. They are being active more than ever. You see, especially during this health emergency crisis, actually the volunteering local community organizations who have been active during the hard health emergency situations have been the migrant and refugee-led organizations who have helped them not only at the the grassroots level practically on daily basis, but also have raised their voice at the policy level to the Brussels. So these are the things that could be as mentioned as achievements of the last 5 years. And the involvement of one more actor is the private sector, which is also important. I think, I don't know if it is in all different countries, but in our city, for example, there's several initiatives that are supported by the private sector, by business sector. The empowerment of refugees, initiatives done by refugees for refugees. So these are the examples that could be mentioned. I will stop here and I will be happy to answer if there was any question later.
Thank you so much, Masooma, for those really important insights. Heaven, over to you for the final presentation.
Thank you, Manmit. And yes, it will be an actual presentation, I'm afraid. So let me just share my screen and I'll begin. Actually, before I begin, just to say a few kind of introductory comments, I guess. And again, reflecting very much what other people on this panel have said about the kind of history of where we come from and how that's reflected in this kind of contemporary situation that we have. I think it's really important to look at what's happened within Europe, but not in terms of, as Masooma says, not in terms of there being a crisis of refugees, but a crisis of politics and a crisis of identity, as Catherine has absolutely said as well. And I think, when we did our research with the Manmit project, when we were very much engaged with speaking to migrants and refugees as they were arriving in 2015 and understanding the context of those decisions to come to Europe, two things were very clear. Firstly, those that came to Europe are a very tiny percentage of refugees in the world, as we all know. That's well-known fact for those that want to hear that fact. But also the kind of drivers of that movement are very much embedded in things happening outside of Europe, but some of those things Europe is directly involved in, such as, for example, the support that's given to abusive regimes, for example, and the European policy is very clearly oriented towards exclusion, while simultaneously supporting regimes that are, in directly violating the rights of not only their own populations, but refugee populations, and the government of Sudan is the obvious example of that. So I think that's a really important context for my presentation, really. I think the second point, just by way of introduction, is again the point that was made at the beginning by Manmit, is the importance of including refugees and migrants in these conversations, because so much of the Eurocentrism of European policymaking is then reflected in how others then talk about refugee issues without actually engaging the populations that are directly affected. And the very convoluted title of the project that I currently am involved in is looking specifically at South-South migration. And I think, shifting the gaze away from Europe is sometimes what's needed to better understand what it is that's going on in other contexts and to escape some of the Eurocentrism of the current political debates. Having said that, I'm now going to focus back into Europe because that is the nature of this discussion, but specifically to focus on the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on the politics of refugee protection in Europe, which, as others have said in this panel discussion, has very much exacerbated or accelerated existing trends. I don't think for 1 minute this is new, what I'm about to say, but I think it's really important to bear in mind how COVID is now being used to sort of enhance some of the things that already are being used by European states to exclude others from protection. And just in terms of, sorry, I'm just trying now, of course, to try and get my slides to move, and they don't want to for some reason. Interesting. I'm not sure why my slides are not moving, and I may have to just abandon them as a consequence. Here we go. So just first of all, to say by way of introduction, and this is very much what others have said, that refugee protection has always been deeply political. Lucy talked about it in terms of the kind of racist construction of a refugee and the exclusion specifically of those outside of Europe. But this symbolism of refugee protection has of course increased and shifted as people have engaged with migration issues in different ways. And even in what we are calling, a crisis, we saw very much the differences of different states within Europe in terms of the politics of protection within Europe itself. So Germany was accused of throwing open the borders of Europe, and it's very gendered, the way in which that then became an attack specifically on Angela Merkel. Greece and Italy were accused of neglecting their obligations, and then of course Macedonia agreed to open up borders with Greece in order to speed up their own EU membership. So the kind of aspirations of EU member states, or aspirational EU member states, then played out in the way in which the crisis was responded to. But by talking up the threat of migration for more than a decade, or indeed 20 or 30 years, as Catherine says, Europe has not only found itself really ill-equipped to deal with this situation, but also has ended up lashing out at fellow and emerging member states, because the kind of differences between those member states has become very clear. And I think what we see with COVID-19 is effectively similar processes taking place. So COVID-19 is very much not the great equalizer, as some have claimed. Indeed, as Antonio Guterres has said, COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray revealing fractures in the fragile skeletons of the societies we have built. And to build on the kind of boat analogy that we often refer to when talking about migration across the Mediterranean, while we're all floating on the same sea, it's clear that some are in super yachts whilst others are clinging to drifting debris. So I think that what the pandemic has done is essentially to expose the existing inequalities and also amplify and deepen them. So the effects of the pandemic, as we know, are racialized, they're gendered, and they're disproportionately affecting those that are living in poverty, who are not only at greater risk of getting infected, also carry the brunt of the economic fallout. So what we're seeing is not only widening socioeconomic inequalities within as well as between countries, but that within those contexts, those who are living in precarity already are losing out, regardless of whether those countries are defined as rich or poor. So I think what we're seeing is that refugees and other migrants sit at the intersection of the racialization, gendering, and poverty-related consequences of COVID. And in the European context, we can see that happening in particular ways. So, for example, the border closures that happened immediately following the pandemic have actually not been lifted, as you might expect. They have clearly been opened borders since April 2020, when UNHCR did their research. But the reality is that even at that time, a number of states, 57 identified by UNHCR, including many in Europe, were simply not making exception for people seeking asylum, even though there was a consensus within the UN system that there absolutely had to be allowances for those people who were nonetheless forced to move in search of protection. We've also seen COVID used as an excuse to suspend asylum procedures for those refugees able to reach countries prior to the pandemic and living in very poor living conditions, particularly Greece, which is a situation which of course is nothing new, but is ongoing. And we've also seen that refugees are disproportionately impacted due to their marginalized socioeconomic position in virtually all countries within and outside Europe. And so while some of those impacts might be sort of understood as unfortunate side effects of the pandemic, that's a pretty generous interpretation of what's going on, frankly. I actually think that what's happening is that states are using the pandemic to continue to do what they had previously been doing, and also using the pandemic to say that their first priority should be the health of their own populations, and that somehow that then excludes them from responsibility for either marginalized populations within their own context or those that might need to enter those countries in order to seek protection. And this is a photograph from the new camp that was built in Moria following the fire that took place last year, and the conditions are appalling, frankly, and no one is really in any meaningful way interested in addressing some of these conditions, including the fact that the transmission of COVID in those contexts is, of course, more likely to increase. So I think what's also clear is that states are effectively not only using COVID-19 as a pretext to evade their responsibilities for refugee and international law and to introduce more restrictive policies, but they're also presenting the needs of refugees and other migrants as a problem, if you like, which governments can't be expected to handle in the context of the pandemic. So we're seeing on the one hand, European states saying our priority is the safety of our own populations and we can't be put at risk as a consequence of COVID, but for example, through border closures. But also we're seeing that fear that's associated with migration and has been historically associated also with disease is now being weaponized, and migrants in some contexts are being blamed both for the spread of the virus, but also used as scapegoats by politicians who've been exploiting the pandemic for political mileage. So, you know, examples from the outset of the pandemic included Hungary blaming Iranian students for the arrival of COVID-19 in Hungary and using that as a pretext to deport Iranians. Italy closed its borders to refugees in fall last year, arguing that ports can't be classified as a place of safety due to COVID-19. And since that time, thousands of refugees and migrants have been held on quarantine ships off the coast of Sicily. Now, of course, Italy has been trying to prevent the arrivals of people into its ports for, well, not just for the last 5 years, but actually long before that. And so this, it seems to me, became used as a pretext for justifying that on the basis of COVID being both the risk of people coming with COVID, but also this argument that somehow Italy wasn't safe because of COVID, meant that they could justifiably hold refugees offshore. Greece suspended its asylum procedures in March last year after Turkey opened its borders, and again in May, blaming COVID-19 for the decision to suspend procedures, when in fact at this time, you know, things had absolutely changed. So we see, again, the use of COVID-19 to justify suspending asylum procedures. And I think the new pact on migration and asylum is interesting for a number of reasons, not least the fact that it includes provisions for the suspension of asylum procedures in times of crisis without necessarily defining what a crisis might be. And so I think we are seeing, as Catherine pointed out, the kind of exacerbation or acceleration of what was already happening, but increasingly with COVID-19 being used as somehow the justification for that. And again, here's another image. This is of people being held on boats off the coast of Italy. I live in Italy ordinarily, and we hear very little about these boats, but we know that they exist. Catherine may be able to say more about them, but I think it's very interesting that, as Masooma and others have pointed out, I mean, there is actually more support for refugees and migrants more generally, and more positive kind of opinion around these issues. But interestingly, some of these stories are being kept entirely out of the press, or rather other stories are being prioritized. And the things that would ordinarily in other contexts has been seen as totally unacceptable have become accepted as something of the norm. So I think the politics of this is very clear, but they're absolutely not new politics. But the coming together of these narratives around the fear of the health consequences of migration with the fear of migration narrative has shifted and changed some of the ways in which the crisis of various kinds are being used to exclude refugees from the protection to which they're entitled. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those insightful and detailed presentations that I think are very complimentary. And what we'll do now is we'll have some discussion. And also I'd like to remind everyone that if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the function at the bottom of the screen. I have a question for Masooma actually to start off our discussion. Masooma, I was so interested to hear about the work that you do at the grassroots level and how important all of that is. You talk about supporting refugees and refugee empowerment. And I think the audience will be really keen to, and I'm very keen to hear the sorts of things that you do with refugees and how you achieve empowerment and your particular experience of doing that work.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, we at Female Fellows, we actually started with making tandems of a migrant and refugee women with a local. So we call the newcomer and local tandems. So that's how it is called. We try to find a partner for a woman, a refugee or a migrant woman. Mostly they are in reception centers. We started in the emergency centers actually when almost 5 years back now as a small project, and then that grew up to an association. And now we are working in 4 different cities, mostly in southern Germany in the state of Baden-Württemberg. So we are, I'm myself based in Stuttgart, the capital of Baden-Württemberg. We are bringing the women together. They meet, usually that was the idea was prior to COVID that they meet once every week. And then they are supported somehow on daily work, their daily lives. And actually the idea is not that the local woman will be supporting the newcomer, will be helping. It's somehow learning process from each other. It is that they're the local citizens. Sometimes they do learn, they are supported by the refugee and migrant women who are here. And we are doing monthly workshops. They are the self-defense workshops. They are the intercultural workshops, previously live and now online. So these are mostly what we do. But that's the grassroots work that you asked about us. But we are trying also to take part in the city discussions that's on the at the policy level. We are also a member of ECRID at Brussels level, trying to also bring the voice of migrant and refugees, not only them, but also the women, more specifically at the policy level.
Thank you so much. And I think even the work that I've done around minority women in particular, those sorts of encounters can be extremely powerful in fostering, you know, commonality and dialogue. So thank you for sharing those insights. So I have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask the other panelists if you've got any questions for each other, and then we'll move on to the Q&A from our audience. So does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask one of the co-panelists?
I have a question for Masooma. I think your work is so inspiring. I'd be really interested to know if your organization could change anything within Germany of the context of the situation of the people that you work with and yourself in refugee reception. What would it be? What if you could get the ear of Angela Merkel? What would you ask?
Yes. Thank you for this very interesting question. Actually, we are trying on some integration policy specifically fitting to women, because they're generally now women left behind. So the problem is that the general, the integration policies, that the services that are for the refugees, they are the same for everyone. But women, sometimes they mostly, with our experience and the work that we do, we see that the women need sometimes the additional support because they're taking care of the children. They cannot attend the usual integration services provided by government. For example, a woman who's pregnant and gives birth to a child is left in the reception center or where she lives for the duration of almost 2 to 3 years. And they do not get kita places for their children for another few years. So that is the problem, that they're left behind. And no one really see that as a matter, but that is a challenge. And you know that the life of women, specifically women, for integration of the new generation of the newcomers in the European society is of very specific importance and attention. So that is what we are trying to, so far, unfortunately, no success, I would say, at the policy level, any change, but they are supporting programs for women, for example, under which we are working. There are also additional support from other actors in the city. They're trying to give, additional courses, the timing of the courses, sometimes in the evenings, sometimes on weekends. There are additional, volunteer support for women not to be left behind for a very long time period. So that is what actually I would wish, and the specific women-centered integration policies for refugees and asylum seekers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Masooma. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask each other? If not, we'll move straight on to the Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so we've got some really interesting questions coming through from our audience. So we'll start with one from Ewan from London, who asks, what impact do the speakers believe the recent series of alleged serious misconduct at EU Frontex will have on the treatment of migrants and their fates if returned to Libya? Should there be a more direct involvement of member states in cooperation with the UK and various UN agencies? Catherine, thank you.
Yes, let me jump in on this Frontex question. I think eventually this whole set of scandals it should, but I think it probably will eventually lead to the resignation or the sacking of the director of Frontex, as well it should. We're in a situation now where there's investigations going on by the European Parliament, Olaf, the anti-fraud office, the European Ombudsperson, as well as litigation and what's being exposed by the media. The part of the difficulty is that Frontex is managed by the member states as an EU agency, so its management board is composed of the EU member states, with the Commission present as well, but no representative from the European Parliament. So in the long term, one of the changes we propose is changing that management board. I mention that because what Frontex is doing follows, unfortunately, the strategy that is supported by many countries, which is prevention of arrivals at all costs. I think, though, even within that strategy, there are decisions that lie with the management of Frontex and the responsibility is there. So, for instance, ECRE and others recommended the addition of these fundamental rights officers, given the expansion in Frontex's mandate and role, as a sort of accountability mechanism to counter some of that increased power, and they simply haven't been recruited. So that's a management decision. I would just add as a supplementary point, given the background of the person asking the question there, so many of these violations and actions at the borders are justified by this reference to tackling organised crime and to ending smuggling. But anybody who works on those issues sees the myths in that argument. Many of these restrictive approaches actually increase the operation of transnational organised criminal groups, and they actually benefit. And we see also more and more dangerous organised criminal groups becoming involved. And indeed a collapse in the distinction between smuggling and trafficking when different kinds of groups get involved. The point is that push factors mean that people have to seek protection in Europe, and refugees have no choice but to use smugglers. So I think questioning this approach and then justifying all kinds of actions on the basis that it is tackling organised crime or tackling smuggling has to be questioned.
Thank you, Catherine. We have another question here from Hanul Cho, who's in Korea, who asks, do you think that the pandemic is negatively affecting NGO-led search and rescue or other missions? And I think we could probably have a bit more of a general discussion here about COVID, because you know, several of you have talked about the different ways that COVID has impacted various aspects of this issue. So can we start with just maybe thinking about this particular issue of search and rescue missions and how COVID has impacted that? Heaven?
Thanks. I mean, there's a couple of questions that refer to COVID, including one on the sort of health of migrants and refugees living within Europe. I'm not sure that I'm well placed to talk specifically about the the NGO search and rescue efforts, beyond the fact that we know that the criminalization of search and rescue efforts that Lucy referred to in her presentation is an ongoing challenge, but it's being pushed back on because, you know, the problem is that the organizations that have been involved in this historically have been basically criminalized, and then a kind of COVID on top has inevitably limited the possibilities of what they're trying to do. But many of them are continuing to do that work. The problem we have, I think, is a bigger one, which is the pushbacks from Europe, essentially. So what we're seeing happening in Libya now, in particular, in terms of the large quantities of pushbacks from the region, from the Mediterranean back to Libya, basically funded by the European Union and member states. I mean, this is the more pressing issue, and I don't know that that's necessarily tied directly to COVID, but it's certainly, I think, using COVID as a sort of, you know, COVID has been very much taking up lots of people's attention for good reason in many contexts, and it certainly detracts from attention being paid to these issues, let's say. And on the other broader issue of their impacts on migrants and refugees and migrants more generally in Europe, I would say there's two that are obvious. One is the impact on livelihoods, which we know to be an issue globally. But imagine if you're, you know, struggling in the context of COVID ordinarily, and we all have been for various reasons, but you have no papers, no way of accessing any state support that might be available in the context of the pandemic, certainly no furloughed wages or whatever that might be available to people in certain areas of employment. So that's an issue. And the second issue is access to vaccinations, which we know to be problematic, again, for people without paperwork. And again, you think about migrants in Europe. I'm a migrant in Europe. I live in Italy. I'm a privileged migrant in Europe for sure, and I'm white, which definitely helps. But I can't get it. I can't, under Italian law, you can't easily get access to immunizations if you're a migrant. And I think that is the case for many migrants in Europe who are simply not able to access what's available in terms of the vaccination programs. So whilst there's huge inequality in access to vaccinations, for sure, globally, there's also inequalities within Europe. And I think these inequalities are writ through everything to do with what we're talking about. Inequalities in access to protection, inequality in opportunities to make a livelihood, inequalities in access to health, and nobody is talking about inequality. And for me, in the context of migration, that absolutely has to be a focus. So, sorry, it's slightly off the question, but I think, you know, the idea that there's a kind of like Europe has one model and everything outside of Europe is different. I think there's really significant inequalities within Europe related to poverty, related to gender, and related to race. And migrants, of course, as I said, are at this intersection often of those three strands of difference, if you like.
Lucy?
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I think it's clear, and you know, Heaven gave a really good outline of that in her presentation, that just thinking about the context of people even arriving and being allowed to disembark, we live in this permanent state of exception where we're permanently in an exceptional context where exceptional, really, you know, dark things that should not be ordinarily undertaken are. But COVID just sort of gave that turbo boost sort of thing. So even when there was not a case of COVID on the continent of Africa, boats with African nationals were not allowed to dock in Greece because of the risk of disease. And that kind of the trope of migrants bringing diseases is a really really long-standing one, even though all of the evidence that we have suggests actually that the health of migrants declines upon living in reception in host states, in part because of access to healthcare, even where these are some of the best healthcare systems in the world that can cope with any sort of health problems that people might have. So yeah, I think we've seen these measures which have meant that the refugee rights or the right to apply for asylum or enter a state have been effectively paused during the pandemic as an excuse. And then for people who have been here, just as Heaven said, all of those kinds of inequalities. I mean, in a number of countries, there has been a relaxation of rules so that irrespective of the papers that you have, you can get vaccinated. But in the context of the broader hostile environment that people have been living under, would you then present yourself and give any authority any information about, like, why would you trust them? Because that is clearly not going to be in good faith. So yeah, I think like everything about the context has been given a sort of a turbo boost by COVID. And I think that's to be expected. But the concern is that every time there is a perception of one of these exceptional crises, a suite of new curtailments of rights and rolling back of rights is introduced, and you never really get them back. It's like once something is taken away, it then takes like 50 years to win it back, sort of thing. So I think that sort of long-standing legacy is like a great concern to me at the moment.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to another question now. Catherine, there's one for you specifically that says from Rosa Von, who says, Catherine, could you please explain a little bit more about the politicization of the courts?
Yes, thank you, Rosa, for that question. Let me briefly say that we see this at national level and at European level. At national level, if you look at asylum decision making, there's such divergence across the EU that it's very hard to find an explanation for that divergence without going to the question of political interference in judicial decision making. So in terms of the protection rates, the percentage of people of from a particular country of origin who will be granted protection, and how that varies from one member state to another, and then the types of protection that people are awarded, all of that is varies hugely. So for instance, the same with no objective grounds that are linked to the cases themselves. For Afghanistan, it's particularly noticeable. So the same applicants may have a 3% chance of getting protection in one member state compared to 98% in another, even though the facts of the case are similar. And we've examined this, and we just can't find any objective reasons why that would be the case, which might relate, for instance, to the different kinds of cases, different types of people, categories of people going to a particular country. No, so it lies in either incompetence in decision making. It lies in things like the absence of respect for procedural guarantees, such as access to legal assistance, removal of appeals levels, but also political direction and political interference in decision making. That's what we've called the asylum lottery at ECRE. So that's one element. The other element that I referred to is a few worrying signs from the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. As ECRE, we're involved in litigation, being both support for individual cases and support to individual asylum lawyers all across Europe, but we're also involved in strategic cases in Strasbourg, Luxembourg, UN mechanisms, and highest national courts. And we've seen that at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, there have been a number of decisions that are rather problematic. I'm referring to the Ilyas and Ahmed decision and ND and NT. In both cases, there are different, more alarmist and less alarmist interpretations of those two decisions. But it's certainly a move away from let's say, previous jurisprudence at the Strasbourg court in some senses. The argument is made that reflects a certain politicization of the Strasbourg court, which can occur in different ways, of course, through the appointment of judges by the countries that are state parties to the convention, and by other means of pressure and debate. So that's what I meant by that point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Catherine. Heaven?
Yeah, just to build on that point, and I think that's absolutely right, but I think again it's nothing new. We've seen the politicization of determination procedures way back in history, and in the relatively recent past, the sort of last 2 decades, there are very noticeable ways in which countries have granted or not granted protection to individuals from particular states, reflecting their own particular political interests or positions. So the differential decision-making rates that Catherine refers to are absolutely appalling at the moment, but they have historically, I think, always been an issue that many people have raised concerns about. I know when I was doing my research in the late 90s on decision-making and the differential rates, that was even an issue back then. And for example, in the UK context, you saw incredibly different rates of protection for Iraqi nationals before and after the UK's involvement in that particular conflict. So, you know, having sorted the issue in Iraq, it was then deemed that refugees from Iraq didn't need protection because the British had been involved in resolving the issues that might impact on them. So I think it's definitely the case that those politics exist, but it's not the case necessarily that they are entirely new. I think they're a feature of European policymaking for a long time.
I see we seem to have lost our chair.
I thought I'd frozen, but I actually don't think it was me.
I might jump in, and I might just take advantage of that and jump in to answer one of the questions that I see in the chat from somebody called Kevin Dykes, where Kevin is saying that it all seems very hopeless. Do we need a sort of social movement to respond to this, a Refugee Lives Matter, for instance? I would say actually that it's not hopeless, despite the very negative and critical things that we've all been saying. From our perspective at ECRE, many of these issues, it's like a perpetual struggle, like many questions of struggles for rights and human rights of particular groups and groups that may be less powerful and marginalized. And in some senses, it's maybe not even as contentious as other rights struggles, because with the question of asylum and refugee protection, I think in Europe, a lot of people realize and remember that anybody can become a refugee, anybody can be a refugee. It's within the histories and background of many people within Europe, and of course many countries within Europe in recent history and in people's memories. So it's not to say that there's necessarily reasons for optimism, but there's reasons not to give up and consider that these kind of actions and activities are hopeless. In terms of the suggestion for a campaign, our view is always that every possible action needs to be taken. So that, as ECRE, we work on litigation, on advocacy, on communications, as many activities as we can with our members across Europe. And I think certainly the element of campaigning and people standing up in the way that we've seen with other social movements is extremely important. And that's not sort of something that we would lead, because as a sort of Brussels-based human rights network with a particular focus, sometimes public campaigning by certain NGOs or certain actors is even counterproductive. I think it's crucial to have self-advocacy, but I think it's also crucial in public campaigning that we have some of the different voices that are not necessarily as public as they could be, such as the private sector, such as people, I don't know, celebrities, sports stars, others, that speak out rather than perhaps what we might call the usual suspects, or those with a clear interest in what is clearly a deep conflict within Europe. So I've taken the liberty, if we have Dr. Bhambra back, I'll hand back to her, or perhaps to the other panelists for their response to questions.
I think this is really interesting question. I haven't actually looked at the question, but you drawing attention to it, Catherine. And I do think in the context of the UK at the moment, I do not feel optimistic at all, but I think the idea of being hopeless is like nothing would be achieved. And I have been thinking about these kinds of questions in this quite serious moment that we're at with UK asylum policy at the moment. And I think to some extent, it does require, like, the answers are not going to be produced by academics or on one panel or by one person in one conversation. And if you think about spaces where there genuinely has been a complete transformation of the way that we talk about things, like through the feminist movement or disability rights or sexuality, those things have come through generation-long mobilizations and conversations and arguments and protests and the kinds of multi-platform strategies that Catherine is talking about just now. So I think to some extent we do need some big mobilization where the whole way that we think and talk about refugee issues is transformed. But at the same time, I'm conscious when I say that there are already loads of people doing loads of things all over the place. And everywhere that you find the worst abuses by states and by the EU, you find amazing people who give up their time to rescue people, to man alarm phones, and to start people like Masooma starting new NGOs and movements and support networks and everything. So it's probably already there, but probably in order to actually transform the whole conversation, a longer and bigger transformation of the way that we talk about things and broader across populations probably will have to happen. I have to hope that transformation can happen even beyond my lifetime, because otherwise you can feel hopeless, I think. I think that Heaven wants to say something on that too.
I do, but I'm conscious that Sarah is now chairing. So Sarah, is it okay if I add on to that question or that point? Thank you.
Yes, please.
No, I mean, thanks, Sarah. I mean, I just wanted to say something about kind of attitude formation and the kinds of ideas of movements. I think absolutely what Lucy and Masooma are saying is completely right. A lot of the things that are most effective come, if you like, from the bottom up. I mean, the reality of attitudes towards refugee issues and migration more generally are incredibly and inherently contradictory. You know, many people are migrants, live with migrants, have friendships and relationships with people with migrant backgrounds as their next door neighbors. They have an often very positive personal experience of migration and refugee issues if they come across them. But the political narratives and the lack of political leadership at the national level and at the state level, the interstate level, of course, in terms of the European Union, has really brought out the worst in people's understandings of these issues. And it's partly because they don't understand the issues. And so, you know, we've tried over the last 25 years really to try and give people more factual information, thinking that this will somehow, you know, mean that they're more empathetic, sympathetic. But the truth is that refugee issues are really, in my view, a touchstone for many other issues and concerns that people have, to do with the precarity of their own situations, often their own precarious employment situations, their own feelings of insecurity of one kind or another, and the kind of whole issue of refugeeness and migration sort of feeds into those and is deliberately fed into those by politicians, of course, to mobilize support for particular initiatives which don't really get to the heart or the cause of why citizens are feeling very insecure in their own lives, essentially. So it's a scapegoating, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And this idea of a social movement is something like Black Lives Matter. The issue with that is that, of course, refugees are also often Black. And that's the problem with many of these social movements, is they tend to treat refugees as though they're somehow out with other movements for social justice. And in truth, what needs to happen is that that social justice impacts on everybody. And a lack of social justice or opportunities for social justice is partly why people are kind of turning in on one another. And it's also what politicians are playing up to. And of course, the media loves to exacerbate through its own representation of the issue. So I think the kind of separation out of refugees from broader issues of racial equality, of political equality, of gender issues, this is about social issues, social justice writ large. And separating out refugees leads to, in my experience, lots of individualized campaigns or quite specific movements that actually then miss out on the connections between the kinds of inequalities and marginalization that multiple groups are experiencing in society. So, Manmit's back. So
I'm so sorry,
and hand back over to you.
No, please continue. I can't see.
No, I finished anyway. I'd said my piece and probably more than enough.
Do we have any more questions or comments on the chat? I'm afraid I can't see everything from my phone.
Yes, Manny, if you'd like, I could step in. I'll read the question out to you and our audience.
That would be great.
Our panelists. There's one that has also garnered, I think, some attention. It's from Simon Ufford from Imperial War Museums. And he's asking about the causes of displacement and the potential failure of the EU and the United Nations in stopping them. I think he has a bit more extended questions, but I think this is already something we can post to our panelists about. And I mean, Masooma also spoke to this, the reason that people are leaving their homes, the reasons people are leaving their countries. Is there a failure from the EU, from the UN to address these?
Please feel free to just unmute yourselves and just contribute to the question if anyone's got any suggestions for responses.
Yes, perhaps I'll jump in if no one else is. I think I just read all through Simon's question, and I think he's spot on with this analysis. This and part of our alternative to the current approach is lies in foreign policy and changing foreign policy. And I think that there are things that can be done to tackle the causes of forced displacement. And that includes none of which are simple and none of which are short term. And that includes looking at how to create security for people in countries elsewhere, focusing on human security in the long term. And it involves creation of livelihoods, proper development policy, just trade policies, and so on. And I think there's a huge body of evidence about what role external actors can play in those contexts, and very often the role is actually to support local actors to resolve conflict, to build and deliver services for populations, and so on. Unfortunately, what we see now is almost the opposite, that external policies, European external policies, but also the UK's external policies, are at risk of being captured by these very narrowly defined migration control objectives. So rather than investing in these efforts to try to understand and tackle the reasons for forced displacement, there's instead a switch and a diversion of funding. And a lot of that risks being very counterproductive, because it may lead to an exacerbation of the reasons why people leave, because it involves, in a number of cases, as we see on an ongoing basis, cooperation with parts of the state that are themselves repressive in other countries. And I think underlying that is also the point that the questioner raises as well. I mean, it's not just about investing in some of these positive efforts to try to tackle the causes of displacement. Above all, it would be good not to cause the displacement in the first place. And to not be engaging, for instance, in military adventures that lead to displacement, that create more conflict, and so on. And again, some of that can seem quite hopeless if we look at what is often the direction of foreign policy. I would say again, it's not hopeless in the sense that it's always a balance. There's always those who promote a particular approach and a particular type of international relations. I mean, one that is supposedly self-interested, even though actually it's not. And then other efforts to have a more enlightened and different approach. And something like the militarization, military approaches versus approaches based on conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and supporting peace are things that we've seen for hundreds of years. So I can only say it would be worse if we didn't have the resistance and the alternatives being put forward and the attempts to hold people accountable when they do engage in different policies that lead to more displacement. And the EU, certainly currently, the UN perhaps less so, but EU foreign policy is currently a sort of battleground for these issues, with attempts by states who have shown very little interest in the idea of EU foreign policy and the new European External Action Service, for instance, now trying to get involved because they want to deploy those resources to control migration. And the big resistance, of course, comes from countries themselves and their societies.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll step in while you're here. I had a question, Catherine, on your very interesting presentation when you're talking about the relationship between COVID and attitudes towards immigration. And I think COVID's quite an important case, but I think, could you tell us a little bit more about what you found in terms of the role of COVID in shaping people's perceptions of, inclusion and belonging?
Yes, I think it's very interesting. We've heard, of course, many of the negative impacts of COVID, and we should certainly not be complacent about those negative impacts, but there have also been positive changes, and that's included things like a certain relaxing of detention regimes for certain categories of people with third country nationals within Europe, a certain expansion in rights to labour market access, for instance, a certain appreciation of the value and the extent to which all European countries are dependent on people originally from elsewhere. Many of them have become citizens, some not, but for basic essential functions. And then there was very interesting public opinion surveys coming out showing that in the last few years there's been a change in public opinion, and the one I'm referring to in particular is Pew Research, where in recent years we've been a bit actually skeptical about some of the way they present migration issues. That's just a side note. I hope they're not listening, but in the recent survey that was published 2 weeks ago, and it was there was an article in the Financial Times on it as well. It was considered that important, but has shown across European countries that people have now a different attitude towards people from outside, originally from other places, saying that the percentage of people who consider that they can integrate, that they can become citizens, that they are part of the country has gone up. And there are a number of other positive results in some of those measures that measure public opinion towards people from elsewhere. I mean, for the biggest way to describe it. So I think that's important, unexpected finding. But if we look at in the long term, we see that the trend in public opinion is also in that direction across almost all European countries, that there is more openness towards immigration and a sort of consistent support for refugee protection. What changes is when governments become dominated by political forces that have a very hostile approach. And that's unsurprising, I mean, as well.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. It's very interesting. I'll certainly be looking to read more of those findings. I think now we're coming to the end of this event. I would like to thank you all so much for your presentations and the audience for your engagement and questions. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around different facets of this issue. One of the terms that will really stick with me, I think, when Lucy said many states are still stuck in the exclusionary logics of the past, and I think that kind of really sums up the way that, you know, we need to think about how we approach these issues going forward. But I'd welcome the panelists to reflect on that or anything else, and just perhaps everyone could just give some brief closing comments before we close the event in terms of their work or what they see as the most pressing issue going forward. Maybe Catherine, if we start with you.
Sure, thanks very much. Let me just conclude by saying that I think despite this bleak picture, there are alternatives, and there are realistic alternatives. Sometimes they're actually more realistic than some of this false solutions based on trying to externalize everybody. I'll conclude by reference to some of those that we put forward. I mean, we argue for compliance with existing standards on asylum. The standards are there in place, instead of coming up with new and ever more unworkable legal changes to actually focus on what's already in place. And then to deal with some of those immediate humanitarian crises as such, where there's a humanitarian imperative, for instance, on search and rescue. There was one question that we haven't got into, but I'll refer the questioner to the plan that we launched today with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International for the Central Mediterranean. And then we've got other alternatives, safe and legal routes for everybody, for those who need protection, but also legal migration for many other categories of people. I think there was a question somewhere about what would be the one thing that you would change. I think a massive expansion in legal opportunities for movement, for those who need protection and for those who don't, who want to move for other reasons that are perfectly valid. And then in addition, we would talk about inclusion in Europe through rights, respect and regularization as an alternative to some of these restrictive approaches, which also create social tension. And finally, foreign policy that looks at the causes of forced displacement, not at preventing migration, given that it's very often refugees and people with protection who are not able to move. And so working on those areas is an alternative way forward, even though sometimes it seems quite a struggle to get to convince and persuade on those.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Lucy, I know you have to leave on time, so perhaps just some brief comments from you.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose my main concern is the sort of resilience of this current narrative around tackling smuggling. I think somebody else talked about it, tackling smuggling. So the policies create the crisis of people having to travel through unsafe means and risking their lives and often dying across various bodies of water within and on the edges of Europe. But then the policy, so it's like you create this crisis and then the policies you propose to solve them just make it worse. And so that it seems such a resilient narrative, and it's something that's playing on my mind at the moment. But I think my overall view is that we need to deal with the actual fact of people existing and being in need, and not spend so many millions, I don't know, does it go into billions, just of so much money and so much time and so much effort trying to make them go away and invisibilize them, and just like, if maybe we can just make them disappear if we throw more money at it, and actually seek actual solutions for the situations, or not solutions, actually responses, durable responses to the situation that presents itself. And I feel like if the same amount of time and money could be devoted to thinking about dealing with that, then we wouldn't need to so perpetually create new crises. Yeah, that'd be my last thing. And I do have to go, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It was a pleasure to hear from you. And thank you for all of your contributions. Masooma, any final comments from you? It would be great to hear.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, most of the points they are already mentioned by the colleagues. But one thing I wanted to emphasize at the end is the participation or the inclusion of migrant and refugee-led organizations at policy discussions. And mostly the initiatives and the efforts that are focused on labor market integration, there is a need that there is more on the political participation of refugees and their social and cultural aspects as well. And there was a good discussion about this one a few minutes ago. And I'm also very happy to share an essay or a working paper of mine on refugee-led organizations, their role in the policy discussions and policy contributions, some of the challenges and the opportunities that they have faced. I have interviewed some of the refugee-led organizations across 7 different EU member states, and also some policy makers who also discussed about the demand for their contribution. I think that will be interesting for some of the participants, and some of the questions that raised were related to this. And I thank you with that.
Thank you, Masooma. We'll all be very interested to read your research, and thank you for your contributions and I think the very unique insights that you've given at the kind of grassroots sort of family, sort of community level. I think they're really important. Heaven, finally, any comments from you to just finish off the event?
Yeah, thanks. I think this point's been made by several people already. It is really important to maintain hope and know that you can make a difference, because most of us working in this area for many years wouldn't do this unless we believe that what we do has the potential to change what's possible for people. But I suppose one of the things that I have said already but would like to emphasize is I do think it's really important to tie back what's going on and has been going on for many years in relation to refugees into broader issues of social justice. I think, seeing refugees as a particular or unique group is important. There are very particular issues affecting refugees, certainly in terms of their legal protection, but I think there are broader issues here of social justice and deep issues of structural inequality related to global north, global south, to issues of gender, to race, to these broader issues. Unless we're prepared to start talking about the problems of patriarchy, racism, and global capitalism, then I think the possibility of actually addressing structurally some of the things that are happening is going to be very different. If we had those conversations, it would take very many more people with us, because refugees are just one group of many groups that are actually not benefiting well from the current structures within which we've decided to organize ourselves. And I think some of those bigger conversations would really help push forward this particular debate.
Thank you, Heaven. I think that's a great place to end this event. And I'd like to again thank all of our speakers for all of their insights and their detailed presentations. And also to thank the European Institute and the 89 Initiative for organising this event and inviting me to chair, which I've enjoyed very much. And thank you to the audience for taking part and all of your very interesting questions. Thank you.